Hi, I'm Lana, and my partner is Foley, and this week in Leading the Class, we're discussing Chapter 8, Opposition to Slavery. Anti-slavery begins in America. The anti-slavery movement was the beginning of the abolition of slavery. The anti-slavery movement reflected economic, intellectual, and moral changes that affected the Atlantic world during the Age of Revolution that began in the 1760s. The United States had forged two separate anti-slavery movements that had prolonged until the end of the Civil War. Both the movements were separate, but coincided and influenced each other. The first movement arose in the South among slaves with the help of free African Americans and very few sympathetic white people. The second anti-slavery movement began in the North and consisted of both black and white abolitionists. Although abolitionists were a small minority, they are more prevalent in the North than the South. The second anti-slavery movement, however, was different from the first and from the revolutions before. Before, slaves only sought freedom through either non-violent or violent means. Through this new anti-slavery movement in the North, they sought to destroy slavery as a social system. In the North, white people had controlled the larger anti-slavery organizations, although African Americans led in direct action against slavery and held more empathy for their own community. In the Upper South, African Americans could not openly establish and participate in anti-slavery organizations. Despite all, African Americans cooperated covertly and informally with white abolitionists. The second anti-slavery movement began during the 1730s when white Quakers in New Jersey and Pennsylvania realized that slave holdings contradicted their belief in spiritual equality and started advocating for the abolition of slaves. Quakers emphasized nonviolence and expected slavery to be abolished peacefully and gradually. It wasn't until the American Revolution, French Revolution, and Haitian struggle did both the North and South become revitalized by these movements and change their nature. The revolutionary doctrine claimed that all men had a natural right to life, liberty, and property. This was endorsed by three revolutionary leaders and was supported by Quakers to help African Americans and the anti-slavery movement. In 1794, they regrouped as the Society for Promotion of the Abolition of Slavery. Among the first few new members to join were Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin. They then influenced Alexander Hamilton and John Jay to join. Hamilton and Jay also helped organize New York's first anti-slavery organization. Prince Hall, the most prominent and influential black abolitionist, supported the doctrine and contended that African Americans have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedom. In early Northern anti-slavery movement, both black and white abolitionists had similar goals. However, Quakers rarely associated themselves with African Americans or welcomed them to their meetings and had separate organizations. White abolitionists did very little for slaves living in the South and supported such laws that kept free black people from enjoying rights they were subject to in the North. From Gabriel to Denmark Vesey. Gabriel's slave revolt conspiracy of 1800 in Virginia owed as much to the revolutionary ideology as the Northern anti-slavery movement did. With the arrival of Haitian refugees in the state led to slave unrest throughout the 1790s, and Gabriel had hoped to attract French revolutionary support. Although he was betrayed and him and his 26 followers executed, the revolutionary spirit and influence was still established. Virginia authorities had to suppress another slavery conspiracy, and for years to come, more minor revolts erupted. Gabriel's theory had two consequences. The first involved the Quaker-led Chesapeake anti-slavery societies. These organizations had been small and weak compared to the anti-slavery societies in the North. Chesapeake societies concentrated more on helping free slaves illegally rather than promoting emancipation. And after Gabriel's revolution, smaller anti-slavery societies were suppressed. The second consequence involved mostly white Southerners and Northerners, and that after Gabriel's revolution, they believed that as long as African Americans lived amongst them, they would constantly be in a race war. They claimed that people of African descent were naturally suited for bondage and that free African Americans were dangerous and criminals. Thomas Jefferson coined the phrase, the wolf by the ear, and stated that once white Southerners had enslaved black people, it would be impossible for them to free them safely. Without the restrictions of slavery on African Americans, they would become more economic competitors to white workers, a perpetual criminal class, and revolutionary threat to white rule. In Charleston, South Carolina, 1822, Denmark Vesey, a free, educated black man, had organized a massive slave revolt and posed a threat to white Southerners. Vesey was more religious and held classes in Charleston African Methodist Episcopal Church, such as AME. He believed in the Bible verses that claim the promise of freedom from slavery. Vesey and his associates planned to capture arms and bullets and seize control of Charleston. Weeks leading to the revolution were Vesey's men being arrested, and 131 suspects were rounded up. 76 convicted, and 35 others, including Vesey, were hung. 37 banished, and 4 white men received prison sentences and fines. After the execution, Charleston city government destroyed what remained of the AME church, and now white churches had to supervise black churches. They also sought to have stricter slave patrols and ban slaves from reading. The path toward a more radical anti-slavery movement. Gabriel's conspiracy, Vesey's conspiracy, and the publication of Walker's appeal all took place over a relatively same long period of economic, political, and social turmoil. With the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, this led to cotton cultivation, and wherever cotton went and was grown, slavery followed. By the late 1820s, Southern slaveholders and their slaves had pushed into Mexican province of Texas. In 1825, the Erie Canal linked this region economically to the Northeast. Railroads carried the old Northwest's agriculture products to East Coast cities. As expansion in trade became more accessible, African Americans who were subject to domestic slave trade became more valuable, and their mobility came with a high price. As cities grew and immigration from Europe increased, native free blacks and white Americans had to compete for employment. As farmers became more dependent on urban markets to sell their crops, they became more wary of the system and policies and felt threatened by African Americans' way of life. Due to fear, they took out all their blame on African Americans. Slavery and politics. In the South, they claimed that John Quincy Adams had cheated Andrew Jackson out of presidency in 1852, and this reflected on the conspiracies from Gabriel and Vesey. Jackson's supporters claimed that Adams favored a wealthy intellectual elite at the expense of the common white man, such as slaveholders. This led to the creation of the Democratic Party and Jackson's victory in the presidential race. The Democratic Party also represented the interests of the South slaveholding elite, and Democratic politicians in both the North and South favored a state right doctrine that protected slavery from national government interference. They fought to make the right to hold human property inviolate and forced the expansion of slavery into newer regions. Democratic politicians were a part of the slave power conspiracy and openly advocated for white supremacy. Even with claims that every man is free in their new democratic doctrine, this was only a way to hold special privileges and cater towards white men. Democratic politicians demanded the removal of Native Americans, and this led to the Cherokee Trail of Tears. All Democratic leaders believed God and nature had designed African Americans to be slaves. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, William H. Seward, and John Quincy Adams emphasized Christian morality and an active national government. They opposed Jackson and created the Whig Party. They criticized the inhumanity of slaveholders, and when free black men would vote, they favored the Whig Party.
The Second Great Awakening. Religion played a significant role in America by influencing the government and its citizens. The Great Awakening took place from the 1730s to 1740s and was a time where emotional preaching and hymns were used to encourage men and women to embrace Jesus and reform their lives. The Second Great Awakening was a similar time period which took place throughout the 1830s. Its purpose was to create more order within American society. However, it also had an effect on black churches. Leaders encouraged the creation of separate black churches. These churches were an essential part of the anti-slavery movement. The Second Great Awakening helped to revitalize the nation's spirituality and to encourage its citizens to join reform movements. The Benevolent Empire. There was an emphasis placed on practical Christianity, meaning those who were truly saved must oppose sin and save others. This emphasis of religious action took place during the 1820s to 1830s and was known as the Benevolent Empire. It created a system of church-led organizations meant to fight sin. The Benevolent Empire had many positive outcomes, including encouraging self-improvement, limiting alcohol consumption, prison reform, etc. An important outcome of the time period was the creation of additional organizations which supported the abolishment of slavery. Colonization. The American Colonization Society was a prominent organization of the Benevolent Empire. However, while claiming to support the abolishment of slavery, the ACA's true motivations were questionable. The ACS was composed of white leaders, some of which were prominent slaveholders. The ACS proposed a twofold program to abolish slavery. First, abolish slavery gradually and potentially give slave owners compensation for giving up their property. Second, send freed slaves and previously freed African Americans to Africa. The ACS founders believed slave owners would not emancipate slaves if they thought there was a chance for blacks to become a dangerous free class. While its agenda was questionable, the ACS was an important aspect of the Benevolent Empire. Even slave owners of the Upper South began to support the idea of emancipation as long as it followed the agenda of the ACS. Advocates of colonization. Initially, the agenda of the African American Colonization Society gained support from black abolitionists. One such leader was Paul Cuff, an African American Quaker who believed in the colonization of Africa by blacks. Doing so would allow blacks to be free of discrimination by whites. American evangelicalism also encouraged the colonization of Africa, as this would be a way for blacks to spread Christianity. In 1815, Cuff took 34 African Americans to the colony of Sierra Leone. After his death, Daniel Crooker continued his work where he took 86 Africans as well. By 1838, around 2,500 colonists had made the journey, and in 1847, Liberia became an independent colony. However, by 1860, only 10,000 blacks had made the journey. Prior to 1860, there was evidence that the American Colonization Society's agenda could never truly succeed. In the 1820s, there was also an attempt to send African Americans to Haiti. However, language and cultural barriers caused a third of the population to return to America. Some black opposition to colonization. Some African Americans always were against the idea of overseas colonization. Samuel Cornish was another critic who instead called for blacks to take action against slavery in the U.S. He published the newspaper Freedom Journal alongside with co-founder John Rushworm. However, it was later discontinued as Rushworm's views on the ACS differed from his. Fear began developing that colonization would be forced onto African Americans if they desired to be free, and by the mid-1820s, black leaders' opinions on the ACS shifted. The ACS was seen as a pro slavery organization which gave blacks the dilemma of staying enslaved or leaving America. Abolitionists argued that blacks knew nothing of Africa and that being forced to leave maintained a racist ideology that they had no right to freedom on their own land. Black abolitionist women. Black women also joined men in opposing slavery, however, gender roles of the 19th century affected their participation. Laws and custom prevented women from engaging in politics, professions, and the majority of businesses. Respectable women only concerned themselves with domestic issues, meaning opportunity for action was rare. The first formal abolitionist group of black women had to work within these constrictions. Leaders included Charlotte Forten and Maria W. Stewart. Charlotte also went on to form the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society alongside other women, both black and white. On the other hand, Stewart's career went on to have
The Baltimore Alliance. Among the stronger black abolitionist opponents of the ACS were William Watkins, Jacob Greener, and Hezekiah Grice. All three worked in Baltimore with a white Quaker author, Benjamin Lundy, who published an anti-slavery newspaper named The Genius of the Universal Emancipation, which heavily criticized white colonization. Grice, who later changed his stance and critique on colonization, became the principal founder of the National Black Convention movement, which served as a forum for black abolitionists from 1830 to the 1850s. They then influenced William Lloyd Garrison, who a few years later became the most influential American anti-slavery leader. Lundy had convinced Garrison to leave Massachusetts and move to Baltimore. However, before coming to Baltimore, Garrison thought that gradual abolition was neither practical nor moral. Gradualism was impractical and constantly put off general emancipation. He saw it as immoral because it encouraged slaveholders to continue their tyrant and violence in criminally oppressing African Americans. Garrison slowly initiated bonds with African Americans and then intensified his relations when he served 49 days in Baltimore jail on charges that he had libelled a slave trade. Garrison then published an abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston and led the anti-slavery movement there. While in Baltimore, however, he made his brand of abolitionism revolutionary, and from the teachings from Watkins, Greener, and other African Americans that the immediate emancipation must be combined with a commitment to racial justice in the United States. Watkins and Greener convinced Garrison that African Americans must have equal rights and not be sent back to Africa after emancipation. His anti-slavery career became a staple when the core of his program was the immediate emancipation without compensating slaveholders and expatriating African Americans. David Walker and Nat Turner. Two important black abolitionists were Nat Turner and David Walker, who also influenced Garrison's brand on abolitionism. Walker, an educated man, had published Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1829. This book was considered a threat and dangerous prophet in the South. In his book, he advocated for slaves to use violence against white supremacy and racism to secure their liberty. Walker had influenced in three different ways. Through his harsh yet truthful words prompted white abolitionists to advocate for immediate emancipation. His book also instilled hope and pride in free African Americans to become militant abolitionists. He was most influential in the South and contributed to the white fear. This chain reaction of instilled fear encouraged the South leaders to make drastic and racist demands on the North, which then helped bring on the Civil War. Nat Turner was an extremely influential abolitionist and had impactful slave conspiracies. In 1831, Turner was the first to initiate a large-scale slave upbringing since 1811. From this event, Turner inspired more revolutions and greater fear in white Southerners. Turner and his band had justifiably killed 57 white Southern men. Turner and 17 associates were convicted and died on the gallows in November. After this revolt, white people panicked and killed in Virginia and North Carolina more than 100 African Americans whom they thought were in a rebel league. They were wrong. They wrongfully murdered 100 African Americans following this. Following the revolt, white people blamed Garrison and other abolitionists for inspiring Turner's revolt. Garrison and other white abolitionists responded by claiming their commitment to a peaceful struggle against slavery. However, they respected Turner and saw him as a hero. Tensions continued to rise through the 1800s, and between peaceful means and admiration for violence against slavery characterized and impacted the anti-slavery movement for the next 30 years. All right, so these are our discussion questions. So the first one is, what were the main differences between the two anti-slavery movements, and why do you think people were more receptive to one movement than the other? And then our second question is, the ACS's agenda for sending African Americans back to Africa was questionable. Nonetheless, a century later, some civil rights leaders continue to believe returning to Africa was the best way to escape discrimination in the United States. Do you believe there was a way for this ever to be a viable solution for enslaved African Americans?